This is a nice little thing. It's called a guava. It's one of the delightful things that the Americans were dropping on the Vietnamese. And I'll pass it round, have a look at it. You'll see little hard pellets and soft metal round it. And the idea of those, the language was lovely. They were guavas, they were pineapples. They were dropped from mother bombs and were absolutely brilliant at maiming people, even more than killing them. And that's more effective as a military activity as you render people incapable of work and others have to look after them. That was what mobilized our generation. It was sort of the huge fight against the war, the most terrible imperialist, brutal war. And at the same time, there were dozens of other movements going on, as we all know. It was the 60s. And one of them was this group of scientists which started off in the States, passionately protesting against the war. And the 245T, the stuff that destroyed the forests, Art Goldstone was actually a central figure. He was beside himself with rage of what had happened to his work. Okay, so the general thesis here is that it's never just Bistros. It was always the local and the global, all the time, everywhere. And I think so, I'd like to sort of open it out. You were doing it that way, I want to do it that way as well, because it was so important. So it's local and the global. It was the 60s, the time of everything. And something I want to press, which we've been talking about it for quite a bit since we got Dave's invitation, then there was the relative autonomy of both science and the universities. I laugh about it now. We used to talk about the proletarianization of science. Boy, we were living dreamland. I mean, it's arrived. And so that's sort of one of the things one has to say. One word on the technologies of reproduction. Some of us were laughing at this room because it was just like home, just where we'd always been. But basically, we had to reproduce by jellies. Anybody who wants to know that, talk about what are we goldies later. But, you know, typewriters, phones were difficult, rather expensive, phone boxes, huge amount by word of mouth, and somehow it got round. I sometimes think that maybe slow politics is as good as slow food, because you do choose the target. Now, the way of making it international was primarily through the natural scientists, because they were the only ones who systematically travelled all the time, everywhere. They had travel budgets. It was part of the production system of science, in that it was not way, for example, the production system of the humanities or the social sciences. So that's very important. They were the travellers. I may have got that wrong. I'd be delighted to hear. Bistros. It came out of chiefly, and I think that's something I want to explore in this talk a little bit, is gender. 2 minutes to go. Right, okay, the technologies were terrible. It was absolutely a crazy organisation. Everybody else was structureless. We had a structure. There was a very simple reason we had a structure, and that was because we needed money. And people have often said, why do we have any money? Well, I went out and got it because it was clear to see, and it was because of a nice Quaker scientist, Roundtree and all of that. You had to have a proper committee, or it looked as if it was one, and therefore we could get the money to run it. And that's how we got the wonderful David Dixon, who was the first secretary and who's absolutely brilliant. And it is a tragedy he died so young. So, quickly on. The precursor to all of Bistros, we have to go back in time, was the CBW, Chemical and Biological Warfare meeting, which was substantially around the Bernal Peace Library. It was a fascinating fusion, mainly scientists, of old left and new left, said forever in Ellie Langer, a great feminist journalist, wrote about science and technology. She leaned over to me and she said, "Say, Hilary, is he party?" So I thought about it. He was talking of William Cecil Powell, FRS and all the rest. And I said, no, the party thinks it's better, he's not. And, I thought, I'm talking to a lovely red diaper woman. So, it was like that. I think the really fun thing was Bistros, and it's been hinted at, I think of it as 100 flowers. I mean, everybody went off. It was the motto of Jerry Rubin. I mean, if you could think of doing something that was worthwhile, you went off and did it. There was no great discussion whether you should do this thing or that. Just people did it. And that absolutely 60s. And so it was a kind of cheery anarchism. I'm going to leave to Jonathan just to say a bit more about this. I have got 2 seconds to get off this one. I'll tell you some of the global links. Huge with the US, strong with France, strong with Italy. Italy was all about toxicology and stuff like and that sort of thing, and the huge accident of Seveso. Germany, that was sitting with Habermas and a whole group. Japan was about, what was it, Minamata?
Yeah.
India was linking with Vandana Shiva, and there was just this whole network of people moving around all the time. And there's lots of others. And of course, there were the Vietnamese themselves, because Steve and I went with Eric Burrock, very old left, to Hanoi, thank God not in a bombing raid. And I did a survey of people in the hospital who'd run, they were refugees from the south to the north, and we're finding out what happened to them with the sprays. That was horrible. And the other one I did with Russ Stetler, Bertie Russell's, one of his assistants, on the effect of gas in northern, on Derry. And that was good fun, because our official contacts were with the civil rights movement. One of their guys had come to the CBW meeting, and also, of course, inevitably with the provos, but they never said anything about them being provos, and I certainly wasn't going to say about anything about them being provos, but that was the times. I mean, all these movements touched into one another in a way I'm not sure if they do now. I hand it over.
Well, you ought to show the...
Yes.
You've been digging through our archives.
This is the gem. Now, nobody to steal it, but I'll let you look at the picture. And that's Stephen. Thank you, my darling.
Just to say, digging through the archives, I was conscious in our collection, not just of the international and the journals and the stuff that was coming out from France and from the States and Italy as well, but also the many different groups that were being formed in Britain at the time. So there was a journal called Red Scientist. The Communist Party had its own communist science group. And even within Busras, there were local groups which were doing their own thing. The Cambridge Society for Social Responsibility in Science was responsible for bringing in initiating the IQ debate, which I'll come back to in a moment. So there was an awful lot going on, of which just Busras was a part. Hilary said something about how we financed, how she organised the money to actually begin the first Busras office. We also, at that stage, thought that one way of actually working to make money was actually to write. And to those of us who were writing, New Scientist or wherever it might be,
that
Jonathan's nodding because he remembers this very well, the money went back into Busras, so that we wrote to help fund the organisation. What did we do? Well, the organisation sprang out of the work on the students' movements, the teach-ins in '68, and the events that Jonathan and I and others were involved in going down to do CBW teach-ins around, the conferences that followed from that and so on, which Hilary spoke about very, very briefly. But once we'd been formed, then all sorts of other groups and things happened. There was Hazards, there was this, there was that, there was the other. And I just want to touch on a very small number of them. Firstly, the issue of military technology and surveillance, which began to obsess us at that stage. Jonathan at least will remember this. I'll pass it round as well. It's called Weapons of Imperialism. And it's one of the earliest documents produced with Busras people, but under the rubric of the Indochina Solidarity Campaign. We learnt very hard from what was going on in the States. There was a huge debate which was begun by Arthur Jensen in the States about black people and intelligence. That came to Britain through a meeting that had been organised by the Cambridge Society for Social Responsibility, where they brought Arthur Jensen over to this country to speak. They had Hans Eysenck, Jensen's equivalent in this country, and a debate which involved the attacks from the British National Front Party at that particular stage. I can't remember which of its various initials it had then. It published a pamphlet which went round the schools called How to Spot a Red Teacher. We organised a pamphlet which went round through the NUT to every school teacher, in every NUT school teacher member in the country, on race intelligence and class and culture, which drove very heavily from, I won't bring the NUT pamphlet, from this one which I'll pass around, which the Americans had produced. So there's the internationalism which is going on there the whole time as well. And finally, just to wrap up within the 10 minutes, all the current issues around genetic engineering, genetic technology and so on, which Dave has been so heavily involved with in vivo fertilization, reproductive technology, were first, I think, sort of launched into public debate in a huge meeting that Bustras held, organised in Friends' House in just opposite Euston Station, which attracted an audience of over 1,000, which was called The Social Impact of Modern Biology. We were able to fund it through a small grant and also through the potential advances on the little book, which was published afterwards.
2 days, Steve. 1 day.
No, it was 2 days. It was 2 days. Yeah.
Did I say 1 day? I'm sorry.
You didn't mention, but is it?
It was a 2-day meeting. Indeed it was. And a lot of the superstars of reductionist molecular biology came and spoke. Some of the radicals were speaking as well.
Stuff from Nobel
Hilary
Prizes.
spoke, Jonathan Beckwith, who isolated the first of the lac operon genes. And Bob Young spoke there as well. And again, it might be worth passing this way around just for people to have a glance at what is, I suppose, Ned Ludd's precursor in this context.
One word on top of that, that meeting was entirely organised by natural scientists. That's when Bustras' sort of more generous spirit simply disappeared down, and they were all the biologists who organised that. And as Maurice Wilkins was a Nobel Prize winner, he invited his mates, who were most of them, the French in particular, close to the left anyway. So it was, it was that, and I think therefore the only reason why Bob and I were asked to speak as a historian and as a sociologist, and nothing to do with our politics, it was simply because of Stephen's presence on the committee, because otherwise, the rest of them couldn't have recognised a sociologist or historian at the 5 paces. So there were a lot of politics going on in that, but it was great fun.
13 minutes, Dave.
Fantastic.